Hey guys, earlier this week I was able to sit down with State Representative Christina Hagan. Christina is the youngest woman ever elected into the House of Representatives, and I was able to go to the House chambers, sit down with her, and talk a little bit about her family and about her faith, and about how those two things shape every decision that she makes in the House. So I hope you enjoy the video.
All right, so Christina, first of all, thank you for doing this interview. I know our church is very excited to have you join us today. And just a little background on you. You were the youngest lady ever elected into the Ohio House of Representatives. So is that something you always wanted to accomplish?
I always wanted to be in public service. I had no idea that I would be the youngest person. In fact, that was something that was actually brought to me by a reporter, so I found that out in the aftermath of becoming a legislator. So it's definitely exciting and I think a wonderful fact, but not why I came to serve necessarily.
Okay. But was running for office kind of always what you wanted to do ever since you were a kid, or?
I am a fairly unique individual in the sense that by the time I was 11 or 12 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
Wow.
I wanted to be in public service, I wanted to help people, and I was blessed to be in a family where public service was really central to what we did, and I actually am a second-generation legislator, so I was able to watch and learn vicariously through my father and both his public works at the local level and then at the state level. And I was the daughter of a small business owner, so my parents actually raised us in the apartment above our business. So I knew how detrimental it could be to not have good governance and not have good people in government, and so it was a natural calling.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. My father was a pastor, and it was kind of natural for me to just step in, so it's very similar.
People frown on it if it is in this arena, and I kind of, prod people to think differently because you would not, think second in a bad way about somebody who was the daughter of a doctor who
Right.
became a doctor, was the daughter or son of a pastor who became a pastor. We think that's wonderful. Suddenly when it happens in the political arena, people think that it's political and they think it's driven by
Right.
that, but they don't recognize that you have a heart for public service,
Right.
and that may be why you're pursuing following in your family's footsteps.
Right. So growing up, you've had to have had this happen when you were young. You sat down on the election night, and there's all this stress and there's all this drama, and you're getting numbers. What was that like for you on the night that you were officially elected the first time?
Well, the first time I was elected, it was fairly unique because I was actually appointed after I had ran for the seat previously at 19 years old, where my own party defeated me.
Wow.
So I actually faced a pretty substantially controversial primary when I was 19, where the party spent about $70,000 against me in a non-incumbent primary. So it's a fairly unique scenario to also have a campaign launched against you, but also for it to be by your own party and that substantial of donor backing for that to be the case. So really, 3 years later, when the opportunity became available, I sought it and I was appointed amongst 8 other candidates seeking the position. So I was elected by this chamber, by the House of Representatives.
Wow.
So a unique scenario, obviously overwhelmed with positive emotions,
Yeah.
knowing that trusting in God and really relying that His calling and His intentions for you are deep. And even if they're not happening in your time, that they can and will happen in His
Right.
time if it's what He's called you to do. So it was really interesting because the day I was appointed was the day I was elected first. And then 2 years later, when I was elected by my district, obviously overwhelming emotion as well to know that not only did the House of Representatives deem me adequate for service, but my district did indeed tenfold because they came and actually elected me with a 20-point lead at only 22 years old. So it was
Yeah.
pretty substantial.
Yeah.
So been incredibly blessed.
Wow. Yeah. So for those of us, I am not a Republican or a Democrat or a Tea Party or a Libertarian. I'm just a Christian who wants to be involved. What does it mean to you when there's the R beside your name? What is a Republican to you?
This is the most difficult question I think that anyone could really ask, because in an ever-changing world, in a broken world, nothing is, I think, as intended to be, and there are a lot of interpretations of how we should live our lives. And even biblically, you will have different denominations and different sects of Christianity, and I believe that to be true even as we view politics. The Republican Party has some fundamental values that I cling and believe to be my moral code and my conscience and how I operate and how I treat people, and that is to actually believe in the power of the individual. And I think that coincides with my Christian faith, that God has uniquely created me,
Right.
and that I have a purpose and I have intentions, and that I do best when I'm supported by people who also believe in my ability, and I think that that is an Imago Dei type issue. So I think I would correlate both my Christian faith with my Republican ideals, although I wouldn't suggest that the overarching Republican conceptual idea is always reflective of my Christian walk, and thus, and sometimes I depart from what may be the Republican umbrella, if you will. So I guess the best thing that I could do is encourage folks to really investigate what it is they believe to be true and draw a parallel with the party that most closely identifies what they believe, because everybody's broken and everybody falls short. And I reiterate that I'm far from perfect every day, but I believe that this party holds the most truths that parallel what I believe to be right and just about serving people.
Okay. Well, so could you tell us a little bit about something I think people don't ever consider, and that is political people have families. And I really think that for most of us, we just kind of lose the fact that they have a husband, they have children, they have a mother and a father. So could you just tell us a little bit about your family?
Sure. My husband is obviously a saint of sorts. He puts up with me on a regular basis. Not many men have women or wives that live in different cities half the week, so he's very trusting, he's very faithful, he's loyal and understanding. He is public service oriented as well. Not only does he work in our small family heating and plumbing business alongside my father and my brothers, but he's also a volunteer firefighter.
Wow.
My brothers are all three volunteer firefighters. My oldest brother is a paramedic. He's also on the SWAT team here in Columbus as a medic. We're all very people service oriented.
Yeah.
Like, our parents raised us knowing that we had a duty to serve others. And my brothers always teased me and said, hey, you have the brains, you can't compromise for this or for that, you have to go out and get it. But at the same time, I know and I understand that any level of service, whether it's serving people at the table, waitressing, like I would do or believe to be an adequate form of service, I think that's just as important as what I do in these chambers. Everybody's sent here to serve and use their hands for helping others. My parents illustrated that. My family's incredibly close, maybe freakishly close. My oldest brothers and I are, my brothers are 5, 8, and 10 years older than I am, but we all live within 2 miles of each other. Wow. And it's like a regular basis that we would be swapping kids, if you will, or helping out, or, you know, hey, I forgot to run to the store for milk, we really need it because, you know, we ran out and Caleb needs to have whole milk, can you grab it from the store or can we borrow yours? And it's just, it's interesting to see how God really works if you let him, because my mom raised us in constant prayer. And, you know, we're growing up and we're like, Mom, please just say Jesus one more time. We're going to lose our minds. And, you know, now I find every day in my walk in my adult life that I'm becoming more and more like my mother. And I appreciate how much her heart was for God and how she wasn't embarrassed to speak to her relationship with him. So it's really interesting. And then, of course, my father is a pillar and pretty fundamental to who I am, because he's always encouraged me to do anything that I set out to do and know that God will guide me in my walk. And even if I fall, that he's going to be there to carry me through the next challenge or the next obstacle. And he was always pushing me beyond my comfort zone. And I think, you know, God kind of calls you to get out of your comfort zone. And I think we'll probably talk today a little bit about how Christians are comfortable in the pews, talking to their neighbor to the left or the right of them. And we even have issues within churches where we don't talk to the people in the front row if we're in the back row. And so Dad always prodded me out of my comfort zone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Dad, I don't want to do post-secondary. I'm in high school. I don't want to go to college. And he's like, you're smart enough. You're good enough. And he always pushed me that extra limit. So I really have to attribute probably 99% of my success to the phenomenal family that I have, who's always there for me and, you know, pushes that dynamic of a family-centric relationship, helping us all in all of our successes.
So it's really important, and it seems like politics is kind of a family thing, which I think a lot of people don't understand. But how do you balance, hey, I'm a wife and politics? How do you balance that family and politics?
Well, I'll be the first to tell you I don't. I work very hard at it, and I think, you know, as Christians, we're expected to be perfect, and we're supposed to be model citizens, and we're supposed to be this, you know, this role model for everyone, but truth be told, we're all flawed. You know, I tend to like working really hard, and I enjoy going to work and working every day, and I could probably work every day and never feel sorry about it. And I know that we have some restrictions on how much we're supposed to be working. Even, Christ himself took breaks on
Right.
Sundays.
Yeah.
So there is something to be said about recognizing boundaries. I find that I get the most rejuvenation when I spend time with my family, so I naturally seek that out and look for it, and I'll spend time with my nieces or nephews in between meetings, or I'll intentionally schedule time with them on the weekends or whenever I can to ensure that we have that family time. My parents and I will try to grab breakfast when I'm in town before I go to a day full of meetings. That way I'm intentionally meeting with them. My brothers and I try to call, but we're also very understanding that our schedules are hectic as we age. But my husband is probably, again, the one deserving of the title of saint, because he is constantly laying down his life and his relationship. And I think it goes to show how important the bond of marriage is, to recognize that this sacrifice is not one person's. It's not just two, it's many people. But my husband, even though he may not be on the front line, if you will, publicly speaking, he's behind me 150%, or I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing, and he wouldn't be able to be as understanding as he is if he didn't know that I was fulfilling my calling.
Sure. So as a pastor, sometimes I have a hard time, like you're saying, balancing work and family. But then the other thing that I run into is it's hard to balance advice from family with the advice that the Bible gives me or church gives me. So how do you balance family advice, especially from a political family, and how do you take that and say, here's what I'm going to listen to, here's what I'm not going to listen to?
Well, I'm really blessed because my family has been jaded by the political arena. So we have been given really sorry circumstances from our own parties, or our own party in different scenarios, and obviously from the opposition on a regular occurrence. So we do not necessarily, or I don't, and I don't believe my father did, and I've been able to follow his role in some ways, but we don't necessarily invest so much in the politics of what's happening as to what we believe to be right, and recognize that, God may have sent me to do this role for now. I don't know how long that will be, and yeah, we can do a lot of political analyzing and, estimate how long we could stay in office and how long we could cling to this role. But really, if we're not fulfilling what we believe to be good and right in a policy form, I don't know that God will return me to the role. And I think that ultimately that's the conscience I have to live with. So I don't necessarily have the dilemma of my father trying to prod me in a political way. I'm really blessed in that sense. And even if he were saying, I'd probably hold off on that, my mom would be right there to say, oh, no, you don't. Or, it's interesting because the family dynamics do play in a bit now that I'm thinking about this in retrospect. My first 4 weeks in office, we dealt with some of the most controversial things the state has seen in probably 3 decades. One being Senate Bill 5, having to do with people's personal income on the public sector side of things, not necessarily equivocally equating with what the private sector would be receiving and paying for in those terms. And then also the heartbeat bill, which obviously I'm very convicted to. But when I stood up and spoke, the first time I spoke, it was for the heartbeat bill, because I heard the conversations, and it just appalled me that we would care more for the ecosystems and the fish in Lake Erie as it related to the Great Lakes Compact than we would for our own humanity. And it was the same day, the same debate, and I just couldn't even stay in my chair. And my mom called me the next day and she said, Christina Marie, you need to be careful about what you're saying. Although it's true, people will chastise you and people will try to harm you. And so she said, having that strong of a voice for life, although it's right, you're still putting yourself in an arena where you may be physically harmed by people who staunchly disagree with you, so you need to be cognizant of that. So she just said, it's dangerous to take such a staunch position, even though she wholeheartedly believed in the position. So you do get advice sometimes that's contrary to the actions you feel called to do. And I think that you just have to take everything with a grain of salt and continually be in prayer and investing yourself in a scriptural basis on a day-to-day interaction to remind yourself where home base is.
Sure. So you co-sponsored the heartbeat bill. For those who might not know exactly what it is, could you just kind of give us a brief rundown of here's what the bill is, and then also here's what it means to me?
The heartbeat bill, if you will, the Fetal Heartbeat Protection Act, is legislation that actually originated in 2011 when I first started in office. I was asked to be a co-sponsor at that time and very new in my role, and just evaluating what the legislation was. I was uncertain. I knew I was 100% pro-life, but the more time I've spent studying the ability to expand protection to the unborn, the more necessary I've recognized my role as a female leader is, and having a strong voice for life, because the opposition, or not even necessarily just the opposition, because I'm not going to say opposition as though it is defined as the literal Democrat opposition. You know, there is opposition in all fronts in this war, because I believe this to be both highly political and highly spiritual. It's not just a conversation between a Republican and a Democrat. It's not a conversation between a man and a woman and her doctor. This is a discussion of whether life has validity or not to us, and whether we believe that child to be created in the image of Christ and have its own unique identity upon the point of conception. So the Heartbeat Bill essentially protects the child, not from the point of conception necessarily, but in great leaps and bounds compared to anything else in this nation, to protect the child at the point that the fetal heartbeat is detectable. And I think that it's a good opportunity to prod the courts to reconsider precedent that they have put into place that has helped us to create this legislation and say, this is what's happened in the past, and here's why we believe this to be a good approach to open the door in the Supreme Court to give an additional voice to the unborn. We really believe, based off of Carhart v. Casey, et cetera, and the actual language the courts gave us, including heartbeat as an indicator of life, that they will have to take into consideration that a beating heart is an independent individual that should be protected by their constitutional right to life without undue process interfering. So, albeit emotionally charged on a lot of fronts, to me it's both fundamentally a constitutional right and also a Christian right, and I think something worth defending regardless of what walk of life you come from. And I think one of the happiest moments I've had while working on this is when I was able to speak from a Christian walk perspective. I said, you know, we are not made in the image of a Democrat. We're not made in the image of a Republican. We're made in the image of Christ. And if we believe that to be true, we should be protecting his image and his perfect creation, because he doesn't make mistakes, regardless of what we think and what culturally has a bound to be true. And so I actually connected with a Democrat and I said, I need your support. And he said, Christina, you know, I'm pro-life and I'm with you, and I see what's happening in my community and really the degrading and chipping away at my humanity in an African-American community. And he said, I just don't know, let me think about this. I'm going to talk to some of my spiritual leaders. And later that day, I reconnected with Representative Patman, and he said, Christina, you know, I think you're right on this. I'm going to be right there beside you. So this is not Republican, this is not Democrat, this is about how we value human life. And so we've been able to, in the last 4 years, although there have been incredible wars within, you know, the movement and different people's opinions and different people's views of constitutionality, we've been able to connect the two sides by having both Republicans and Democrats be supportive of the proposal, which wasn't the case before.
Right. It's almost like you're protecting someone's right to be the next great Democratic president or Republican president. You're allowing them to choose whether they want that. At a young, before they're born, at that age, they have no choice.
Exactly.
So it seems like a no-brainer to me, but what were some of the challenges that you faced regarding this bill?
Naturally, folks who stand on the side of life are often attacked verbally, you know, through written form, et cetera. So we have had those natural challenges that come with taking a strong position of any sort, but naturally with the very, I wouldn't say divisive, but in the opinion of the media, divisive discussion of life v. choice that comes with, you know, a lot of emotional destruction, a lot of really tough debates and discussions. And we sat through testimony of over 30 individuals, you know, probably 20 plus for and, you know, 10 minus against, and each and every one of those had some validity to their conversation and their argument. So it can be mentally draining, both understanding and respecting the opposition, but knowing what you are carrying to be the right path, or the path that defends both a woman and the child and protects the sanctity of the individual, while also allowing for a woman to make a decision previous to that point. Although I don't necessarily agree that abortion is the right aspect to approach, I recognize that we live in the 21st century and we have to get people to the understanding that this is an individual, and I think science is on our side to do that. So the challenges are the normal challenges of feeling the hatred of people that disagree with you, and standing strong against the controversy. And of course, there are dynamics within the life movement, having folks who may be or may not be politically charged working against you because they believe this is something that could, from a desire to gain votes, be detrimental, and bringing in maybe independent or more moderate Democrat votes. They feel they could be lost. I've said I voted for the heartbeat bill, I've carried the heartbeat bill, and I've done nothing but gain support from my district. So I think it proves that this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, but an issue about people and loving people, and I've been successful in that.
Right, yeah. So you mentioned that there's a lot of battles, and I pay attention enough to know that there's a lot of battles and contests from both sides of this party. How do you manage to stay focused when Christians and non-Christians and Democrats and Republicans and Tea Party and Libertarian and people who are for or against are all criticizing you? How did you manage to just keep focused on the bill and getting that bill done despite all that opposition?
Well, I would say that I work hard to value truth and understanding of people. And my mom always said, you know, to my father, who was a staunch Republican, and I believe I am as well, but she always said to him, John, you don't get elected by just Republicans. You know, you serve Democrats and Republicans alike, and independents and everyone else who may not have an affiliation. And so I always think of that when we're vetting testimony. I try not to let things become hyper-partisan for me because they have for someone else. And I try to be cognizant that people are coming from different walks of life, and the people attacking me don't know that I grew up with foster brothers and sisters. They don't know that I have a strong heart and a desire to adopt. They don't know that, you know, I would care to bring children into the world and also care for their path along the way. So I always try to take the attacks with grace and recognition that it's not so much me as it is coming from a different understanding of life. And so I try to use that information to better understand and then even better serve those people and try to connect with people to help them get where the middle ground can be and help them to understand where this is not, you know, about me personally. This is about the folks who haven't been granted the right that I've been granted, and help them to understand. So I guess being attacked or having those harsh criticisms, it's really both operating in my Christian faith and relying on God to know that I'm turning it over. If I were to carry every burden that's been cast my way, I would be laying on this floor in the fetal position. So I really attribute that strength to God giving it to me. I wouldn't have it if it weren't for Him and His calling and His purpose. And so that's how I know when things get tough and I start feeling like, maybe I don't want this political pressure. I recognize I've been given a great responsibility, and God has given me a unique opportunity as a young woman to really alter the cultural discussion on this. And we've been successful in muting the opposition because the attack has always been old white men have no means of having this discussion. And it's so unfair because it's never been just old white men that cared about, you know, the individual, the human life that has not experienced the protection due to it by the Constitution. Many folks feel that way, and so I'm able to provide that perspective with God's grace and His allowing for me to be here. Yeah.
So all this leads up to a debate on the floor, which is a rare occasion. How difficult was it for you to stand up? You're surrounded by your peers, you're surrounded by your friends, and to say what's on your heart. How difficult is that to give a speech in front of all these people you know about this, very divisive issue?
Well, any floor speech always comes with a level of stress. Naturally, something of this magnitude, knowing that 20+ thousand unborn individuals are counting on you to be their voice is relatively stressful, if you will. I think standing up and knowing that nearly half the room hates what you have to say is stressful, but also recognizing that we have nothing to lose. You know, knowing that my district has sent me to do my job. They have sent me with the permission and the torch to carry that. I know I've been charged with responsibility. It's almost as though once you start rolling, God removes the anxiety. It's always when you get started speaking that you don't know that you have the confidence in what you're saying to be heard by others in a way that provides grace with their difference of understanding.
Right.
But once you're starting to engage and start ruling, God really provides that, I guess, the floaties, if you will. You know, if you're thrown into a pool and you don't know how to swim, at first it's intimidating and you don't know how people will respond, but you do know what you believe to be right and that you have confidence that there's a need for that voice. I think God provided that for me, and he always does.
Sure.
So I've seen there's an understanding even from the most contrasted points of opposition. You know, a woman stood up and spoke to her personal scenario that was extremely unique and emotional, and she, you know, accused the entire member-driven support of the bill that they did not understand her circumstance and that they didn't respect her and they were judging her. And I just kind of sat back and I took that in, and I think that was one of the most difficult things to do, because you don't always get to voice the opposition on the House floor. If you're not called upon and there are 15 people standing up, you don't always get the honest rebuttal opportunity, because obviously then I would have been able to speak to all of the women who were in the exact same scenario, who spent their time testifying in the committee process to do just the opposite of what she and her circumstance claimed there needed to be an exemption for. So I think it's very difficult, but it's also, I think, where the ideal is lacking and you can't control the aspects, grace abounds, and you're provided with a comfort that really is not given by this earth, because this earth would have you fall to the ground when you're treated this way.
Yeah, it's people so often think politicians and pastors have nothing in common, but that is one of the main things that we do have in common. Is we have an issue that's on our heart, and it's important to us. For me, it's God, and for you, it is God as well as this issue. And sometimes it's almost like just standing up and letting God speak through you and seeing what he has to say. Real quick, what would you say to a woman who is sitting in your office and she says to you, well, shouldn't I have the right to choose? After all, it's my own body. What would you say to her on a personal level?
Well, I think on a personal level, I would just suggest that we do have many choices as women, many of which I exercise on a daily basis. You know, I'm a female voice in the House of Representatives. It's a pretty neat thing to be able to say. You know, obviously as a woman, I have the decision to decide where I want to go to college, to decide what type of career I want to have, whether I want to be a single or a married individual, whether I want to, you know, the choices are limitless. And I guess there is a choice before the point of conception, and bringing another person or another body into the equation. And again, you know, as it relates to the heartbeat bill, I would reiterate that that particular legislation doesn't completely remove choice for women, although I believe there to be a perfect and unique individual that is created in this process. I would just advocate to her that, you know, again, I'll repeat this, where the ideal is lacking, grace abounds. You know, where you may think you do not have the support and the ability to do something, God always provides, and his intentions are very pure for your life. And whether it seems ideal in the circumstance, you can have joy that is immeasurable by the child that will be brought into your life, or someone else's by your circumstance that you may feel to be ill-fated. And I would just advocate to women that there are so many opportunities to do a wonderful thing for yourself or someone else, that shouldn't be the mentality. While I recognize that we've had this cultural stamp put on us that women have a choice, I think we do have choices, and we can choose to be responsible with our bodies previous to creating another human. And I think in that circumstance that a human is created, we now have a larger equation to consider. And in that equation is an individual that's due the same respect that we have. And I think science is on our side in defining that this is not just a cluster of cells, this is a human life we're discussing and debating. And I would just plead to her understanding of the scientific reality that this is not just a one person plus a doctor equation, but, you know, two, if not even three, when we ultimately ignore the father in the equation as well, but that we should really be identifying and recognizing the validity of that other life that's in the equation.
Right. So this is something, it's a bill that's very important to the church. The church talks about this bill from the pulpit. The church talks to women about this bill. But did the church actually, do you believe, did the church really help with this bill? Were they effective? Were they hurtful?
I would say that we have had pastors testify in support of that have been incredibly helpful. We have pastors who have testified in opposition to. And it was interesting to hear their perspective because the beginning of their proposal, I thought, okay, yeah, that sounds good. You work with women, you have Bible studies. And then they said, it's a woman's body, it's a woman's choice. And I thought, where in scriptural reference do we actually separate ourselves from a cultural understanding of what is acceptable and God's intentions and God's purpose? I mean, it's very clear. I knew you in the womb. I mean, that I don't think there's a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
His perfect creation, if you truly believe in God, that has to be true. But I also would not judge or, underestimate somebody else's Christian walk. So I think it takes a lot of understanding and study and desire to reach out to people. But I would say that the church has been very helpful, but I think any church, and even in my adult life, any church has fallen short of the call. And not to be harshly a critic, but recognizing that as individuals, as people, as government, we fall short, and I think the church can always do more. Absolutely. We feel good about going and doing hammers and nails because everybody likes it and nobody's against that. And we want to be supportive of folks who don't have that home, but what about these folks that are waiting to have a home? We haven't really necessarily gotten up and spoken to the extreme injustice or emphasized, if you will, that's occurring in this nation. And I think something that is definitely one of the largest civil cultural debates that as Christians we could be active in. And I think that many do. And I would encourage those that do to sustain their endurance. I just read an article this morning that a woman in another state had been advocating for the ban of dismemberment abortion since she was 17 years old. And this was in the 70s. And at 60, she had a sigh of relief that now in Kansas, I believe, I apologize if that's not right because I just read it this morning at a glance. She said at a sigh of relief, Kansas has now outlawed dismemberment abortions. And so I think this is not a sprint. This is a long endured race, just like your Christian walk. So we don't get to just go to a pro-life banquet and say, oh, I'm a great pro-life Christian. I think it really takes being vocal and active with both your government and also the people that need your support. When a pregnant girl comes into your congregation, you don't judge her and chastise her. You lift her up and you embrace her. And you try to figure out ways to help her and help that child that you know is created in the image of God. So I guess I would just advocate that we as a church have the wraparound love for God's creation that we believe to be true.
Sure. So the bill, against all odds, passes in the House, and it's a huge relief. It moves on. So what happens next?
What happens next is obviously the same exact route that went through the House will go through the Senate. So we'll have committee hearings if and when the Senate president and the Senate chairman of the appropriate committee hold those hearings. So I think between now and then, as Christians, we need to do a lot of prayer for God's will, and that's something I think is important to remember. While all of this was going on, I was constantly turning it over in prayer. And I think you experienced, and you actually probably saw some of the detriment caused by people who cared the most. So there's no perfect balance of how this occurs. I think it really depends on knowing that God's will prevail, and you can't take on the burden of the shortfalls or the failure in December. You have to just keep carrying the torch and moving forward. So the Senate is another opportunity to carry that torch. Hopefully we'll have deliberations within the next few months. I haven't received any guarantees yet, but I'm going to keep praying and keep asking that they're willing to consider and have the discussion, because I believe it to be absolutely our responsibility, whether you agree with something or not. We shouldn't have the privilege of hiding from an issue that is so substantial. We should have to have the open debate and discussion and then make those decisions based upon what Ohioans bring to us in testimony.
It's funny you mentioned hiding. There seems to be two basic thoughts of Christians in politics. The first is, I'm going to stand in my church, with my church, and yell at anybody who doesn't agree with my church. And then there is a lot of people my age who are all of a sudden having nothing to do with politics at all. So what are your views on that, and how What would you say to someone who says, well, I'm just going to have nothing to do with politics because I'm a Christian first and that's really all that matters? How would you approach that?
Well, I think that I would just advise that you can choose that route, but you will never be in control of that destiny because politics will always have something to do with you. So while you claim to be a Christian and active in your walk, I think faith and works are, dead without one or the other. And so if you have faith, yet you're not actively working with that faith, then you're falling short, or you're doing the works, but you don't have faith in the works, then you're falling short. So I think that's true if you believe that you can ignore what's happening to our nation and our states by the power and influence of our political system. If you believe it to be wrong that a child's life is taken, yet you turn the cheek and you do other things that are Christian oriented, I don't think you're fully picking up the torch that God has probably ignited in you to care for him and his belief for what is good in his image. So I think I would never chastise somebody, but always encourage people to be more involved. It's not easy to be involved. It's very difficult, but at the same time, I don't think we really have much of a choice as Christians in serving others and loving others, especially the least of thee. When we talk about folks who are impoverished and those who can't help themselves, I can't think of a class of individuals who are more disserved by anyone, not just Christians, but any people, any walk of life, than the unborn, because they're cast aside as though they never had a voice, because they're not granted one. So I think it's our job as Christians to really stand up and be active. And again, focus on the long-term race versus the short-term sprint, because things are not often won in this discussion. In the short-term sprint, you have to have that endurance.
Yeah. So maybe there's someone who's out there and they're listening and they're hearing this and they've always thought, well, I'll just have nothing to do with politics. But now they hear this and they're thinking, man, I want to be involved. What can we do besides simply vote? A lot of us just think, well, if I vote, I'm doing my Christian duty to my country. What else could we do?
Well, I think the most significant ailment of our system today is, although we have heightened access with social media and although we have more ability to see what's going on, I don't really feel that we adequately hold our elected officials accountable. So I think, the more data we get, the more we understand what's happening, the more we should be actively involved in ensuring that it's reflection of how we would want not only our dollars to be spent, but essentially our moral code to be acted out. Because I don't think Christians would be happy to know that such a substantial amount of dollars go to aborting children, even if they believe it to be wrong. Their taxpayer dollars are attributing to this, heinous crime. And so I would suggest, really understanding or begging to interact. You're not going to get everything in the first 5 minutes, and I wouldn't expect any person to care about politics as much as I care about politics, but I also wouldn't expect any person to write off an entire profession because they feel one or two people to be inadequate, or there are 3 or 4 people that have set a bad image. So there are bad doctors, there are bad teachers, there are bad elected officials, and there are some really exactly, and there are some really phenomenal ones. So I think it's our job as the American people to elect people that really reflect what we believe in and take it further than the polls, but to say, I'm going to hold you accountable. And I not out of hate or out of a desire to be a pest to you, but out of a desire to care for you and your walk as well, because we have a lot of pressures on us. And if we don't have that strong base suggesting to us that we need to do what we are sent to do, we're going to be pulled in 1,000 different directions. If you think about the state budget, it's cut a million different ways. So there are going to be interested parties coming in and saying to us, you need to do this for this class of people, you need to do this for this walk of life, you need to do this, not all of which may reflect why we are sent to Columbus. So I think it's so important for people to engage and be vocal about what they want to see in government.
Sure. So my young adult group is called Crossroads, and we believe in connecting to 3 different people each day. And that first is to Christ, and to our church, and then to our community. With your busy schedule, with all your different issues and traveling and family, how do you stay connected to Christ?
Well, I do a lot of sermons on the road. I think I've inquired with you about how I could get your sermons electronically. I listen to pastors that are not just Ohio-based. Sometimes I get CDs from my brothers from their churches.
Sure.
Try to call them and have, intentional discussions about our Christian walk and maybe an independent study, if you will, with family or friends. I try to speak with Victoria, my aide. Maybe not as actively as I should, but I try to engage that on occasion. And in fact, her sister, who I used to coach, sent me a link that has really profoundly impacted and helped my marriage that was from a Baptist pastor out of Texas. So I listen a lot to Matt Chandler and his teachings as well. So I try to be not only intentional about my Christian walk in my church congregation type interaction, but also on the regular, interacting that into my life, even if it's not what seems to be an easy thing to do.
Right.
Try to make it intentionally in what I do, because it's easy to fall off track. Even if it's not substantially off track, it's easy to not be Christ-centered if you're not delving into scripture or into that type of reference on a regular basis.
Sure. I'm a fan of Matt Chandler as well, and I listen to a lot of his stuff. I think there's a difference between church and Christ. So how do you stay connected
Prayer.
to church?
Sorry.
Okay.
Or vice versa. Did you mean to
Yes.
Christ or
Yeah,
to church?
to church.
To church, I'm really not great. I'll be
Okay.
honest, because I fall short when it comes to, I think like many people, we've all had experiences at church where we say, okay, well, that was not the message I thought was really reflective of scripture.
Right.
Or, and I fall short to the same ailment as everyone else, that oftentimes we're seeking a service that provides us with fruition instead of seeking to serve when we go to church. And so I think I've been, I was raised in the Methodist church, nothing against them, but they never made me feel on fire. And I know that individually. And then when I was 19, I was Baptist at a non-denominational church for the second time in my life. But more so, my husband and I have gravitated towards the Methodist church because it was where I was raised, but I also am my mother's daughter. She was raised Baptist, and so I feel alive when I'm there, but there's a compromise when you're in marriage. So I think staying connected to the church is more difficult, but I think easier to do when you connect with individuals in the church who are your brothers and sisters in Christ. When you don't rely on your church for perfection, but for energy and reconnection with Christ, that's a more positive way to approach looking for a church than expecting the perfect walk to be created when you sit down in a pew. Because I think you're a great pastor, but I'm sure there's a day that I'd walk in and I'd say, well, he wasn't on his game today. And it's easy to criticize. It's the old joke of, the family went to church and the choir was terrible and everybody got in the car and they were quick to criticize, which we all do because we're critics in our family, right or wrong. And the family donated the money and the kids said, well, I didn't think the church service was all that bad for $2. It cost our family $50 to go to the movies. As Christians, I think, we are subject to a consumer-driven nation that expects perfection, and we expect it delivered immediately. I think that we need to go into our church with a different heart and a different mind, and that is of service and not to be served.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate you.